understood how we are collecting the data from the file or a database table into Spark. So RDD was supported in the previous versions of Spark, but with the latest version of Spark, we have data frame and dataset. Now dataset API is available specifically in Java and Scala programming language, whereas in dataset is not available in Python. So whatever we are going to work and create a collection, it will be a data frame. As we are using the latest version of Spark, we are going to work and code everything in the data frame. Now this is what exactly we saw in the sample example which we just tried in our IDE. So whenever you work with a data frame, you are going to receive the entire data frame if it is structured in a columnar format. So you will have your columns and then the values in the row based objects. What definition says is a data frame is a programming abstraction in the SQL module. Data frame resemble relational database table or Excel spreadsheets with header. The data resides in row and column of different data types. This is what we understood in our previous lecture and program which we executed locally. Now we also saw the Spark session and Spark context when we triggered an interactive session. Let's try to understand what is that concept. Since earlier versions of Spark or PySpark, Spark context is an entry point to Spark programming with RDD and to connect to Spark cluster. Since Spark 2.0 version, Spark session has been introduced and become an entry point to start programming with data frame and dataset. Here we are going to mainly focus on explaining the difference between Spark session and Spark context by defining and describing how to create these two instances and use it from Spark shell. So as we mentioned, Spark context is an entry point to Spark and defined in org.apache.spark package since 1.x version of Spark. But since Spark evolved and the new version Spark 2.0 and later Spark session come into picture, which inherits all the capability of Spark context and has more benefits and powerful methods available. In the previous lecture, if you remember, we saw that when we triggered a Spark shell, Spark itself has given us two objects, one Spark context and one Spark session. When we work in a programming language and IDE, mainly with the latest version of Spark, we are only going to interact with Spark session. Let's revisit our IDE and again look at Spark session and Spark context. As you can see, we are back in our IDE. When we said Spark that please execute and initialize the Spark shell, Spark gave us two objects, which is one is Spark context, which is available as SC, and then Spark session, which is available as Spark. So if you wanted to read here anything, you just need to write spark.read.csv file or a JSON file, and then you need to give the path and you will free to program it further. The same way, when we worked with Spark in IDE, we created our Spark instance with Spark session. We explicitly mentioned that we wanted to create an instance which is type of Spark session, and Spark initially and Spark gave us the object of Spark session, which is easy to implement and good to have in our latest version. If you expand the imports, you will see that Spark session derived from PySpark.sql module. Spark session has inheritance power and methods from Spark context, Hive context and SQL context as well. So in the previous version of Spark, what we need to do is, let's say if we wanted to work with SQL type of queries, we have to explicitly create an SQL context object. Let's say if your code is interacting with Hive, then you have to create Hive context as well, which is a separate instance. Same way for this context and the base APIs, you have to create a Spark context object and you need to work. So in the one single program only, you need to create multiple objects of multiple interfaces. That was bit of tedious work, and so Spark decided to aggregate all of these contexts into one single API and provide the feature and the benefit of it, which ultimately derives as a Spark session. So Spark session has all the capability of context, and you don't really need to inherit or create any of the instances if you have Spark session created. Here the same thing which we described in the previous slide is mentioned here. For core API you need to use Spark context. For streaming based application, which is like Kafka streaming and Spark streaming, you need to use streaming context. And let's say if you wanted to work with SQLs, you have to previously use an SQL context, which is we are talking about the later versions of Spark. But for the latest version of Spark, you just need to use Spark session, which is an unified API. This is a familiar diagram which we discussed in the previous lectures as well. This is a code snippet and it is correlating with Apache Spark architecture. So here we are creating a Spark session, and then on top of it we are configuring our session, Spark session, saying that how we want our session to be helpful. In the code you will see that we have also used enable Hive support. If you implement that in your code with Apache Spark session, you do not need to create an Hive context separately. Spark session will take care of it, and the Spark instance which is going to be returned has the capability to connect with your Hive.